Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. Today I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to be able to get a perfect chrome finish on your lures. And if you've been watching this channel, you know that I've demonstrated this process on many of my videos, creating perfect mirror finishes and then painting and clear coating those finishes to make a lure that just looks absolutely awesome in the sunlight and in the water. Today I'm going to show you every material you'll need to have, every piece of equipment you need to have, all the techniques and tricks, the safety precautions. I'll teach you ways to save a little money on the process, and at the very end, I'll give you an estimated cost per lure to actually give these lures a perfect chrome finish. If that sounds like something you're interested in, stick around. So before we talk about the chemicals we're going to use, let's talk a little bit about what the actual process is. So this isn't paint. This is actually a plating process. You're actually coating the surface of your lure with a very thin coat of silver. And you can do that due to a chemical reaction between these two liquids here. One is your silver solution, which is silver molecules in solution, and the other one is called a reducer, and this is basically a reactant. When these two combine, the combination forces those silver molecules to fall out of solution and coat whatever it is you've put this on. But before you can do that, you have to prepare the surface of the lure. The lure has to start off being perfectly glassy. It's got to have a completely gloss finish like a piece of glass would be. And in fact, this technique has been used for hundreds of years to make mirrors. They would take a piece of glass, they'd pour these solutions on the back of it, the silver would coat the back of the glass, and when you turn over the glass, you've got a perfectly reflective mirror. Now, I went ahead and ordered these really loud lures. I've never bought lure blanks before. Why not? These things were about $11 for 10 of them, and it's a topwater lure. Kind of an interesting looking lure, actually. It's got a nice rattle ball in it with a lot of throw, so it'll actually act a little bit like a weight shift. So I'm kind of excited to finish these things and see how they actually work in the water. But I've got 10 of them, and we're going to chrome plate them all. And we're going to try a couple of different techniques to do the job, and we'll see which one works best. But before we get to any of that, let me just give you a little bit of background history on how I got into this. Early on, when I was making lures, one of the lures that I really liked, and I loved the paint job, and I wanted to replicate that paint job, was a lure that had chrome and gold. And I found that there was a chemical process, this chemical process, and I couldn't find the chemicals anywhere. I ended up buying them in some shady market and on the internet out of Hong Kong. They were really inexpensive. The quality control of the chemicals were pretty bad, and the shelf life of the chemicals were terrible. They didn't last very long at all, but I was able to have some success with them. So I continued to use those chemicals and slowly come up with a process that actually gave me a lot more success. And I was really hooked on that finish. And then I discovered a new source. And I'm going to go ahead and put all the materials that I'm going to use here in the description with links to where you can get them. Fast forward about 3 years into the process of me experimenting with the chemicals and the processes to get the chemicals on, and I discovered Angel Gilding. And they've got really high quality stuff. From the very beginning that I started to use them, I realized what a difference it is to use good quality materials, both in the initial quality of the finish and the durability of the finish. It made a huge difference. I have lures now that are years and years old that still look beautiful. So through all the mishaps with those other chemicals, I developed sort of an unorthodox method of applying the liquids and preparing the lure. And now I've sort of rounded out that technique with some of the suggestions that come from Angel Gilding. As far as the chemicals go, you'll need the main chroming chemicals, which is the silver solution and the reducer. And buy the smallest container. It really goes a long way. You'll need what's called a prep coat, which essentially prepares the surface of the lure to accept the next chemicals. And you'll need the tin activator. And this stuff actually is the last step before you actually put the chrome on. It's sort of a chemical bonding agent. It makes sure that the silver is bonded to the surface really well. And that's really all there is to the chemical side of it. You're also going to need a couple of little pump spray bottles. You don't have to buy expensive ones. Just anything that works nice and consistently and holds a good amount of water because we're going to be using a little bit of distilled water. I probably go through a gallon every 30 or 40 lures that I actually silver plate. You're going to need some way to do some pretty precise measurements of the liquids because these chemicals are actual concentrates, and so they need to be diluted with distilled water. So just a measuring cup will do the trick. Now the products usually come with a way to measure it if it's going to be something very small like the tin activator. And this little syringe measures up to 1 milliliter. So it's divided into tenths of a milliliter. And you can find replacement syringes online so that you don't have to worry about losing it, breaking it, or like I usually do, wiping off the numbers with some cleaning solvents. But here's one that has very, very fine measurements, up to 5 milliliters. And this is stuff I got off Amazon, so I'll have links for them in the description. So before we use our mixing containers, I want to go ahead and wash them. I'm going to use this really mild dishwashing soap. It's Dawn. Now, if you can't get Dawn wherever you are, just find the mildest soap you can find that doesn't have any other additives. It's just a detergent, because you're going to use this to wash your lures prior to actually silver plating it. So I'll just put a drop in there. And I'm worried about the inside, not the outside. And now I'm going to rinse it off with distilled water, which is also called deionized water, if that's what you find around you. I've already got this spray bottle filled with it. Put a little in there, shake it out. All right, and that should do it. And a super important point that I haven't really brought up is that these two actually will react, so they can't cross-contaminate. You can't have these come in contact at all. So it's important that you either clean these out really good between the chemicals, or better yet, use different containers for the two different chemicals. And I store the chemicals that I've already mixed in these little bottles that I get from Harbor Freight. They're 250 milliliters each, and I'm only going to mix 100 milliliters of each one. So I'll label them S for the silver and R for the reactant. We'll start off with the silver. This bottle is 120 milliliters, and this gets mixed 1,000 milliliters of water to 30 milliliters of the concentrate. So this will make 3 liters. The same goes for the reducer and the prep coat. So since I'm making only 100 milliliters, that's 1/10 of a liter. I need 1/10 of 30 milliliters, which is 3 milliliters. So I'll take my little syringe that measures up to 5, and I fill it and up to 3, get rid of any excess, and I'll just squirt the 3 milliliters in there. I'm going to label my syringe with an S. So at this point, you really need to have gloves on because the silver nitrate will stain your hands and your clothes. So it's not a bad idea to put a smock on, which I'll put on in a little bit. When you open it, it smells pretty strongly of like glass cleaner, or obviously ammonia, which isn't terribly dangerous, but it will irritate your lungs. So it's a good idea to wear this when you're spraying. And this is not a fancy respirator. It's really just meant for painting, and it works perfectly. I've owned this for about 3 years and used it specifically for this process. Never had a problem with it. And I don't think I've even changed the filters in those 3 years. They're not too expensive. You can pick one of these things up online for 30 bucks or less. You still want to use this stuff in a ventilated space. And since this is a very close little space, I do have an extractor in my paint booth, but it's not a bad idea to have an open area, but still wear a respirator. So now I'm going to measure out 100 milliliters of water, and I've already cleaned and rinsed this. All right, there you go. I can just pour this in here. So now I'm going to put it in my storage bottle, but if you were mixing the full 250 milliliters, you would have used 7.5 milliliters of the concentrate. And with this beaker re-washed and rinsed, filled it to the 100 milliliter mark. I grab a fresh syringe and I'm going to mark it with an R. And it's the same process. We'll fill this to 3 milliliters. And I'll go ahead and decant this into my holding container. Now, super high precision isn't really needed. You just want to do a really relatively good job at getting the percentages right. All right, we've got our 2 silvering chemicals. Now we need our preparation chemicals. And right now you're probably thinking seems like a lot of work. But actually, once this stuff is mixed up, you can put it in a refrigerator or store it in a cool, dark place that lasts for at least 3 or 4 months. And the only thing you have to remix is the stuff we're going to do right now, which is the tin activator. And in fact, If I wanted to, I could have been chroming right now with the stuff I have stored in the refrigerator. So we're going to mix a half a liter, 500 milliliters, and I'm going to use the syringe that Angel Gilding included in this. And what's funny is it says for oral use only. Don't use this orally. So this gets mixed 1 milliliter for every 250 milliliters of distilled water. So we'll need 2 milliliters. And I try to keep all this stuff in a Ziploc bag just to keep it all tidy. And I'm going to pour this mixed tin activator into one of our sprayers because the recommended way to actually apply it is to spray it on. Now that's another place where I deviate a little bit with my technique that I developed. Instead of spraying it on, I actually have a small container that I dip the lure in and allow the surface to get tinned. And that comes from me trying to save as much material as possible because at the time it was so difficult to get. And I didn't want to use the spray method because it was definitely going to use a lot more material. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix the prep coat. Now I've never used the prep coat. I have my own technique for pre-prepping the surface or, prepping the surface for the tin. I use what's called a flaming method, which is essentially passing a flame over the surface of the lure so that you essentially change the electrochemical energy on the surface so that it doesn't want to beat up the water. It doesn't want to sort of push the water off the surface, but it allows the water to coat really evenly and completely over the surface. And this is supposed to do the same thing as flaming does. And the prep coat gets mixed at the same rate as the two silvering chemicals. It's 30 milliliters. Actually, this one says 970 milliliters instead of a full liter. So that's interesting. But we're going to go ahead and go with 100 milliliters and just use 3 milliliters. I prefer to mix small portions. That makes it easier to dump small portions later. All right. This stuff has a pretty green color. And this stuff really is just an organic surfactant. It's the kind of stuff that gardeners use to sort of break the surface tension on water so that the fertilizers and stuff can be absorbed by the plant a little easier. And the instructions for this stuff says you can spray it on or pour it on. So I'm going to use one of these little squirt bottles. And I figure I can squirt it onto the surface of the lure and get it done that way. So now it's time to go ahead and get these guys prepared. I need to prepare the surface. So I'm going to wipe them down with some alcohol. And then we're going to go ahead and mix up some of this top coat. We'll go into the booth and we'll spray on the top coat. I'm going to leave one of these uncoated because while this is a very smooth plastic surface, it isn't really glassy. And the silver plating isn't going to create a really super glassy reflective surface unless you start off with a really glassy surface under it. So I just want to do one without the glossy surface so you can see what it looks like when you try to do that. So this stuff is good for a year on the shelf, which isn't too bad. And you mix it 8-to-1 by volume or by weight. So we're going to mix it by weight. And of course I'm using the base coat, not the top coat. And I poured in about what I think I need to do 8 lures. And since it's 8-to-1, I'm going to go ahead and pour 24 grams in here to make the math easy. So I've got 24 grams and 8 goes into 24 3 times. So I need to add 3 grams of the hardener for a total of 27 grams. And that's got it right on the money. So before I start clear coating these guys, I just want to remind you that I really do prefer using UV resin. This stuff is a little tricky to use in that you don't want to breathe this stuff and it's really uncomfortable to have to wear this all the time. So make sure if you do this, do it either outside or in an open area or in your shop with the doors open and a good fan blowing. I'm going to have a fan blowing into the room and my extractor blowing out. Again, I'm using an airbrush with a 0.5 millimeter needle. I'm going to start out at about 25, 26 PSI in pressure. Try to keep the pressure down, try to keep the overspray down. The benefit of using this nice, thin, really glossy finish is that it doesn't obscure your carvings. So you don't end up with a real thick, kind of a clunky coating on it. Using this stuff does look a lot more professional. It does look a lot more like something out of a factory. Let's get started. First, I'll wipe it down with some alcohol again, just to be sure I didn't touch them without my gloves. All right. All right, that came out pretty nice. Looks pretty glossy. It takes about 20 minutes for this stuff to set so that you can touch it, but we're gonna leave it dry overnight. Now these two other ones I'm gonna do with the UV resin just to show you the difference. So I'm gonna spray the rest, which is like 4. I'm gonna spray 4 more with the 2-part base coat, put the UV resin on these guys, and we'll leave everything set till tomorrow. All right, we've got our lures prepped, at least the surface is prepped with the clear coat anyway, and the UV epoxy should be set. And let's take a quick look at the difference between the spray-on clear coat and the brushed-on UV epoxy. You can see the UV epoxy, and I'm hoping you'll be able to see this on the camera. You can see how perfectly clear the plastic is. And while you can still see the details in the head, the gill plates and stuff, the little fine scale pattern is gone. And on this one, I'm not sure you'll be able to see it on the camera, but on the spray-on one, you can still kind of see the scale pattern right here, still there, not fully covered up. So that's good. We'll see what a difference it makes for that reflective surface though. So we're ready to start spray chroming these guys. The next thing you're gonna need is some kind of basin or a plastic container like I have to contain all the wastewater and all the splash. And I use this big thing, and we might actually use this today. This is actually a little lure turner that I made a long time ago when I used to do it slightly differently. And if you don't have a ventilated paint booth like I do, there's no reason you can't get out on a porch or a balcony or out on a patio somewhere, because you really don't have to worry about bugs or dust. This is all waterborne stuff, and it's not like paint where you have to worry about those things. But it is a good idea to have a backsplash, and I just took some very thin plastic, put it all together with some tape so that it would fold up into this box. This thin plastic came from a framed poster I had, but you can pretty much use anything. It doesn't have to be clear. In fact, you can just use cardboard and throw it away after you're done. But you definitely want to capture the wastewater, because in the end, you've got to do a little bit of treatment to it to get rid of it. So now that we have everything arranged here, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to apply the two separate chemicals that actually have to be applied simultaneously. They basically have to land on the surface of the lure at the same time. And what I use is my little duplex gun. This is something I made, and it took me a long time to come up with this final design that's worked really well for years, because the guns that they sell you are really meant for larger surfaces, and they use a lot of material. And if you're cost conscious like I am and don't want to just waste material, you're going to want something small. I made a video that I'll go ahead and link here, and I'll link in the description as well, on how to make this. I think I have maybe $20 in this, if that. The gun itself cost me, I think, $6 at Harbor Freight. I made this little bracket. These two little bottles are just airbrush bottles, 2-ounce airbrush bottles, and then you have a little bit of hose and this little block of plastic that I cut off of something and just drilled a couple holes in it. Come to think of it, it's probably closer to $15 or $12 or $15. So how it works is you have to have compressed air, and the air blowing through the gun draws the fluids up out of these little bottles and simultaneously blow it out of the tip. And I'll show you that in a second with some water. Now there are other ways of applying this stuff. There are duplex guns that Angel Gilding sells that don't need a compressor. They're little pump-up sprayers and have a little duplex nozzle. Now you could probably look at that and make your own. I think it's a couple $100. Or you can try what I'm going to try today, just to see if it works, is just having two separate guns with the chemicals in them, and then we'll spray them at the same time, rotate the lure a little bit, spray it some more, and then we can proceed with the rest of the procedure just like we would if we had used the other gun. But that's going to be a bit of an experiment. I've never done it, and if it works, it'll simplify things for a few people. But before we get too far ahead, I'm going to have to wash all these guys. So I'm going to put them all in this little container, wash them with a little Dove soap, and when I'm done with that, we'll get started on actually chroming. All right, I've put in a little bit of distilled water into the bottles just to make sure this gun is working well and to make sure that it's rinsed out and clean. And I've got the pressure set at about 20 psi, but I'm going to lower it a lot more once we get started. But just want to make sure this thing's blowing water out of both nozzles. And you can see it does put out some water pretty quickly. You can also see that it's got a nice even flow from both nozzles. You can see how nice and fine the spray is. That's kind of what you want. And that makes it really efficient, and you use very little material per lure. So I'm satisfied with the way the gun's working. I'm ready to go ahead and load these bottles with our actual silvering chemicals. And I just want you to notice that I've got the bottles really clearly marked. I even have silver tape on one of them, just so I don't make any mistakes as far as swapping bottles at any time. Even the caps are marked because you don't want to cross-contaminate, because you'll ruin a batch. So I'm going to go ahead and fill these bottles right up to the top. They're 2-ounce bottles, which is about 60 milliliters. Now, I'm pretty sure we're not going to use anywhere near that amount. I'm thinking probably half that amount to do those 10 lures. All right, we're going to start off one of the ones that we did with the spray-on base coat, and I'm going to rinse it a little bit. So for the surface prep coat, the green stuff, I'm going to go ahead and use a spray bottle because it does say you can pour it on, but I just think this is going to be more efficient, I hope, to coat it really well. And then I spritz the tinning agent right on top of it. That seems to be working really well. And then we rinse off the excess tinning agent, and we're ready to silver plate. Oops. All right, I gotta laugh because I screwed this one up. You can see how muddled it is. And what I did was, when I went to grab the distilled water bottle, I grabbed the green stuff. So I ruined it. But that gets us to a little bit of a lesson. If you do this, if you mess it up and it comes out looking bad or just incompletely coated, don't sweat it. You can actually just wipe this stuff off. And after a little bit of rubbing, it comes out pretty much how it started. There's a little bit of silver in some of the details. And if you really want to get it perfect, you can get the silver remover from Angel Gilding. It does a little better job than I can do just rubbing it down with alcohol. This thing just needs to be washed again and re-prepped. So I'm going to rinse it off really good with distilled water. And now I'm going to use the green stuff when it's appropriate. And I'll let that sit on the surface just a little bit to be sure it's coated everywhere. And now we tin. And I like letting it sit for a little bit. And I'm going to rinse it and go ahead and silver it again. I'll turn on the evacuator and hold my breath because I haven't put on my respirator. All right, so even after our little bit of mistakes there, this is the same one and it's in perfect shape. Really nice silver job. And what I really like is that, hopefully you can see it, that little scale texture is still on there and looking good. Now I know a bunch of you, before you saw that, were thinking, well, wait a minute, shouldn't you paint it black as a base coat so it really has that nice chrome look? No, you don't have to. It isn't a bad idea to do it, but actually I have found over the years that white is better than black to give it that really crisp, just absolute chrome look. So I'm going to go ahead and do the two other experimental ones. The one that has the original surface on it, no clear coat, and then the one we did with UV epoxy, and I marked that with a little bit of string on the back. All right, another little trick that really gives the lure a really nice finish is to make sure that there's no water droplets on it. And to do that, it's a good idea just to blow dry it. And if you don't have a compressor, you can get some canned air. It really does make a difference. It gives you that nice finish without any water drops. All right, let's take a look at the two that I just did. The one with no gloss coat on it and the one I did with UV resin. Here's what no gloss coat looks like. Kind of what it looks like when you spray it with some inexpensive spray can silver paint. And in contrast, you can see what a mirror finish the UV epoxy creates. Now, I will say that there are some blemishes in it. A couple spots of inconsistency with the silver settling on this stuff. And I've always had that issue. It's usually not bad enough to worry about. Usually comes out so nice that it's really not noticeable. But I have to conclude that, at least with just this one data point, that using this base coat seems to give you a much more consistent finish. I still get all that reflective surface without losing so much of the definition of the details. All right, so the next experiment we're gonna do is trying these guys as just our spritzers. So let me set up and we'll do that next. All right, so I've got it in my little turner. So it's gonna be a bit of a juggling routine. I'm gonna have to spritz with two hands, turn it, spritz, turn it, and then rinse with this stuff. I'll spritz it with the green prep coat first. Now I'll tin it. Make sure that's nice and coated, and you can see there's no beading going on. That's the key. Let's give it a shot. Definitely much more difficult to do. All right, it appears to have worked, but you definitely don't have the control and the nice even spraying that you do with the gun. And it shows there are some little dark spots here and there. You still get a chrome-plated lure with some minor imperfections in it. So maybe with a little more practice, some better bottles, maybe smaller ones with a finer mist, this would prove to be a better technique. So I'm going to go ahead and wipe this stuff off because I can get it better with the gun. I'll get the rest of them done and I'll show you what it looks like at the end. All right. Whew. So you know what? This is really fun for me. It never gets old, just turning plastic into this beautiful chrome finish. Even using these sort of cheap blanks that aren't exactly super refined. There's sandy marks and misalignments. They're not too bad. And the silver turns them into something just a little more. So we ended up using about 1 ounce, which is like 30 milliliters. So I get a lot of emails and questions about what I do with this wastewater. And obviously it's got heavy metals in it and chemicals, and you can't pour it down the drain. Typically do is save it in a container until I have about a gallon of it. And then I'll go ahead and run it through a really simple little process where you add a little bit of powdered clay. It actually binds all those heavy metals together. The water ends up being clean enough to pour down the drain. And that little ball of clay is safe to go ahead and put in your garbage. So it's a really simple process and not worth doing right here. So for those of you who are interested, I'll go ahead and put a link to a video on the Angel Gilding website that shows the process in full, and you'll see how easy it is. And the next step is to protect that finish. Now, it's pretty tough. You can actually touch it and not mar it, but it needs to be protected with some sort of clear coat. Now, this is where I get a lot of emails and texts, people asking, so what's the best way to do it? How do you do it without marring it? Silver is very reactive and it will tarnish. Just like silver jewelry will tarnish and turn black. If you put a clear coat on it that makes it react, it will start to turn gray or black or brown, and you definitely don't want that. So using this top coat is the ticket. Now, in the past, what I've done, I've put on a mid coat that I knew protected the silver from reacting. And I've always used floor wax. Floor wax works really well on this, but over time, it doesn't last as long as a resin. So what I would typically do is spray it with floor wax, let it dry, and then clear coat it with a light UV clear coat. The problem has always been that 2 out of 10 of those lures would start to turn dark and get a little bit blotchy. So the floor wax wasn't 100% foolproof. And the other issue is when you put a clear coat over something that's super reflective, that clear coat will cause the light to be filtered. And as the light goes through it, reflects from the silver back up, the one color that tends not to be filtered is yellow. And so you'll end up with a very yellowish tinge to your nice crisp silver. And the only way really to combat that is to filter it with violet. So these are both 2-part resin coatings, the base coat and the top coat. The only difference between them is that this one is tinted violet. So the next step is to prep enough top coat to coat, I guess, 9, because one of them is that one that came out terrible that doesn't need to be top coated. All right, so we're gonna mix the same amount, just under an ounce, 24 grams of the actual resin, and 3 grams of the hardener. That's got it. All right, I'm gonna paint one at a time. All right, so looks like I mixed just a little bit too much. In fact, probably twice as much as I needed, because I learned pretty quickly that you can overdo this violet stuff, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So we'll get to the numbers in a second here, but I just want to show you what happens when you give it 2 coats instead of just 1. You can see how the violet accumulates right there. Just a little too much, and you do get a little bit of a violet hue, but it's really very subtle and certainly doesn't ruin the lure. But lesson learned, a single thorough pass of paint and you've got it covered. Now, when I usually do it with UV resin and I tint my UV resin is violet, but still really transparent. So I can put on a nice thick coat and it just blocks the yellow and doesn't add any violet. So this is just a lesson learned. I just need to give it 1 coat, not 2 or 3. So let's talk first about what I actually have from Angel Gilding and what the costs of them are. So the 2-part silver, that's 2 bottles. It's $163 for that set. The tinting agent, $16 for 60 milliliters. The prep coat, that's that green stuff, is $30 for 120 milliliters. The base coat is $75 for that quart, and the top coat is $85 for. The total is $369. So you can consider that sort of your entry price, plus whatever tools you need to buy, or if you want to just make your own gun. It's pretty easy to do, and just about anybody who's slightly handy can do it. Next up is the cost per unit. So the silvering chemicals are $1.36 per milliliter. That's before it's diluted. The tinting agent is 27 cents per milliliter. The prep coat is 25 cents per milliliter. The base coat is $2.34 per ounce. And the top coat is $2.06. And in this column, you see how much we actually use. We use 3 milliliters of the silvering chemicals, 2 milliliters of the tin, 3 milliliters of the green stuff, the pre-coat, an ounce of the base coat, and a half an ounce of the top coat. And here's what we spent on each one of them. $4.08 for the silvering chemicals, 54 cents for the tin, 75 cents for the pre-coat, $2.34 for the base coat, $1.33 because we only used half an ounce of the top coat. Total price is $9.04, and we have 10 lures, but I redid 2 of them. So I'm going to call it 12 lures. So it comes out to about 75 cents per lure. Now that can actually add a little bit of money to your lure build, considering you can buy a decent blank for $1.50 and you end up spending half that value in silver. But who can say no to this? I think that added 75 cents added a lot more value to this, at least as eye candy, if nothing else. If you try this and it absolutely doesn't spin your top, well, maybe it's not for you. But every time I do this, it just looks like magic to me. Turning plastic into silver just seems like mythic alchemy, and I just love to do it because it'll turn a basic paint job into what I think is a bit of a museum piece. All right, guys, that's it for this week. I hope I answered all those questions I had out there for silver plating, and I hope this gives you a little incentive to give it a shot. I know dropping 400 bucks is not a small thing. And if you've thought of doing this before but haven't, or are thinking about doing it and maybe won't do it, let me know why. Let me know what's keeping you from doing it, or if you've done it and you just got frustrated with it. I'd really like to hear who else has been doing it, because realistically, as far as all the lure makers that I know of that are on YouTube, I'm the only one doing it. So let me know what you think. Do you think it's worth it? Do you think you would do it? I'd really love to know how you guys feel about it, since a lot of you guys make a lot more lures than I do. All right, guys, I'll see you next Friday for, I'm thinking I want to go fishing. Or maybe we'll do a lure build. I don't know. We'll see then.